Hey everybody, and welcome back. So now that we've finished our first exam, or the first unit of Geology 112, Dinosaurs in the Age of Reptiles, we're ready to start moving through geologic time. So the first unit was really kind of covering all of the basics and the tools that we need to move forward. We now understand some basics of stratigraphy, evolution, geologic time, and so on. What we're going to do now is start with the very beginning of early Earth history, the Precambrian, and work our way through the Paleozoic era that brings us to the Mesozoic, the true age of dinosaurs. So before we jump into all the different groups of dinosaurs and how they lived, let's look at the world that they were essentially inheriting um, in the Mesozoic era. So we're going to be focusing on the Paleozoic era, the geologic era that happened immediately before the Age of Reptiles. So let's jump right in. First, I want to make sure we have some terminology down because we're going to be using some of these abbreviations pretty much for the rest of the semester. So anytime you see the letters GA, MA, or KA, these are referring to packages of time. So GA is billions of years, or gigaanna. So for example, the Earth is 4.6 GA, or billion years. MA is megaanna, or millions of years, and KA, kiloanna, thousands of years, something we probably won't be getting to for quite a while. But we will be discussing the MAGA arena of time for the next couple of lectures. So let's begin, well, with the beginning. That seems like a good place to start. We're going to talk about Precambrian history first. Now, this represents the origin of the Earth about 4.6 billion years ago to about 540 million years ago. So this is a significant portion of Earth history, a vastly significant portion of Earth history. But we're going to be covering it a bit briefly because there's not a lot going on from a biological or paleontological perspective, but there are some exciting things punctuated throughout. Now, it's one thing to see a geological time scale like we see in the center of the screen, where your Precambrian is kind of crunched down there at the bottom, but if you look to the right, that's a more accurate representation of Earth history. The Precambrian makes up a vast majority of Earth history. Most of what we talk about with fossils and dinosaurs and any of the changes in life going on are really dealing more with what we call the Phanerozoic eon. So after the Precambrian. The Precambrian is a name that we use collectively for Hadean, Archean, Proterozoic, these three eons that happened before the Phanerozoic. So Phanerozoic means visible life, and that's because from the Cambrian, or about 540 million years ago, to today, we have visible life on the planet. This doesn't mean we didn't have life in the Precambrian. It just means that we don't see a lot of it in the Precambrian. And it's really not until a bit later in the Precambrian. So the Precambrian eon, really, the Precambrian term is something we use collectively for the Hadean, Archean, and Proterozoic eons. So this is really the first 3.8 billion years out of 4.5 billion years of Earth history. The Hadean is the origin of the Earth. This is when our planet is just forming. We have a lot of meteorite bombardment still happening. Life may have started towards the end of the Hadean, and conditions may have been right at the time for life to start a couple of times, but really it only has to stay around once to progress through time. The Archean is from about 3.8 to 2.5 billion years ago. And this is when we know life is around. We do see viable remaining life, but it's still pretty rare. And then the Proterozoic from 2.5 billion to 540 million. This is when we get multicellular organisms. Now, the name Proterozoic means hidden life because when it was named, we didn't know of any fossils in it yet, and the name is still around. But we do actually have life. So the Hadean is from 4.5 or 4.6 billion years to 3.8 billion years. The Archean from 3.8 billion to 2.5 billion, and the Proterozoic from 2.5 billion to 540 million. So what was the world like throughout the Precambrian? Well, remember, that's 3.8 billion years of Earth history. So we have a lot of different changes in atmospheric and ocean conditions. But just to kind of hit some of the main points, the early Archean and prior, was essentially anaerobic, which means you didn't have any free oxygen in the atmosphere, but you had quite a lot of carbon dioxide. Now, when we say free oxygen, I mean that O2 molecule by itself, meaning when you take a deep breath and your blood is becoming oxygenated because you've inhaled oxygen from our atmosphere, you could not have done that in the early Archean or in the Hadean. There was pretty much no oxygen gas in the atmosphere. We had the atom oxygen, but it's tied up in things like carbon dioxide or water or various other chemical compounds. But you would not have had an oxygenated atmosphere the way that we have one today. So how do we know that, though? Well, think about it. Today, we can tell we have an oxygenated atmosphere from a couple of different ways. One, as living things that breathe oxygen, we're all still alive. That's a good indicator. But also think about, especially here in Wisconsin, if you have, what happens to your car every winter after repeatedly leaving it out, or anything, any piece of metal that gets left outside, it starts to rust. That's oxidation of a metal. So we have iron sediments from the Archean. We have sedimentary rocks that have a lot of iron in them. We also have a lot of carbon. And these are things that today, if you leave a carbon-rich organism or metal outside, it's going to rust, it's going to oxidize. We have Archean sedimentary rocks that are unoxidized, and a lot of them. So that means we had an atmosphere in the early portion of the Precambrian that did not have a lot of oxygen in the atmosphere. Certainly not enough to show the evidence that we would see today of oxygen in atmosphere. And I want to point out that oxygen in our atmosphere today is not as much as you might think. It actually makes up just around 20% of the atmosphere. Most of the atmosphere, when you take a deep breath, most of the air you're breathing in is made of nitrogen, which doesn't really do anything. But that 20% of the atmosphere that's oxygen is what helps keep you alive. That's what our bodies need. So we didn't even have 20% back in the Archean. We had virtually none. We also can see this change when we start finding these sedimentary rocks from later in the Archean and going into the Proterozoic that are called banded iron formations. And these are really heavy, dense rocks that are rich in iron, and they're rusted, so they're purple and red striped because of oxygenated iron and chert that make up these rocks. So we can actually look through the Precambrian geological history and see when we started having an increase in oxygen in the atmosphere by the presence of abundant banded iron formations. So here are some of these late Archean, early Proterozoic banded iron formations. So this is probably happening around, so at least 2.5 billion years ago, probably going back to maybe around 3 billion years ago. Late Archean, early Proterozoic, so we have a lot of these banded iron formations. So there's a good foot-long rock hammer for scale, and you can see that purple and red and pink alternating bands in these rocks, and that's because it's metallic iron and oxidized chert. We don't see these in the earlier portions of the Archean or the Hadean, which means we don't start seeing an oxygenated atmosphere until then. Now we have iron-rich rocks from the early Archean, but they're not oxidized like this. So the only way you can get this oxidation is from having an oxygenated atmosphere and oxygenated water interacting with that atmosphere. So we can tell through tips and tricks like this when we start to see oxygen becoming abundant in our atmosphere. Now that's great and cool. We suddenly have oxygen in the atmosphere around the latter portion of the Precambrian, but where did that oxygen come from? That's a big question, and it turns out the answer to that is early life in the Precambrian. So let's look at some examples of what this early life would have looked like. Now, in the image here, I have a structure known as a stromatolite. Now, these are still around today, but they're very, very rare. They only exist in a handful of places on the Earth. Back in the Archean, we had lots of these, and they became even more abundant in the Proterozoic. Stromatolites aren't exactly a living thing in and of itself, but they're actually colonies of living things. So stromatolites are these layered sedimentary structures that first appear around 3.5 billion years ago. And the sediment that makes them up is stuck together by different types of bacteria. So imagine you have a mat in the water of bacteria, and those bacteria get buried by sediment. Well, they don't like that, so they grow up in between the sediment and they form a new layer on top. And then that gets buried, and then they grow up and form a new layer. And so you have these alternating bands, these layers of sediment that were stuck together by different types of bacteria. One of the most important types of bacteria that made up a significant portion of the stromatolite colony are cyanobacteria. We used to call this blue-green algae. It's essentially pond scum. But what's important about this is that it is photosynthetic. Now today, plants are photosynthetic, algae is photosynthetic, pond scum is photosynthetic. That means this type of organism didn't breathe oxygen and emit CO2 like we do as animals. Instead, they would absorb carbon dioxide and use solar radiation to produce sugars, and then they exhale oxygen, just like modern plants and trees do today, and just like algae does today. Algae today in the oceans is one of the major contributors of oxygen to our atmosphere. Stromatolites are the first evidence of an organism that would have fit that model to be producing oxygen. And they live in shallow water. As you can see in this image of a modern day stromatolite, they live in really shallow water because they need all that solar radiation that can penetrate through. If you live in the bottom of the ocean, there's no sunlight that can get down there. So you're not going to be a successful photosynthesizer in darkness. So we start seeing more and more stromatolites forming around the later part of the Archean going into the Proterozoic. And with that, we start seeing more and more banded iron formation. So we see the stromatolites first. First, we have our oxygen producers. And we have geologic structures, the stromatolites, which indicate the presence of our oxygen producers. The presence of the oxygen itself are in the banded iron formations. So these are two geologic structures that are around at about the same time. One, and both of them are part of the story of how our atmosphere became oxygenated. First, we have the producers in the form of stromatolites, and then later we have the evidence of the successful oxygenation in the form of banded iron formation. So this is what modern cyanobacteria looks like under a microscope. It's these little individual box-shaped cells that stick together to form threads or filaments. And they use oxygen as a waste product of photosynthesis, the way that plants and trees do today, the way algae does today, similar, or the inverse, I should say, of what we as animals do as respirating organisms. So we don't photosynthesize, we undergo respiration, where we inhale oxygen, we exhale CO2. They do the opposite. Okay. Now, modern day plants photosynthesize in a slightly different way than cyanobacteria. There's some evidence that that's how plants evolved, was from cyanobacteria, and so they modified the process over time. But it's still a perfectly good working model for how we undergo this chemical reaction. So where do we actually find stromatolites today? Well, today they only live in places that are hypersaline, meaning super salty, and also super cold. So we find them in Shark's Bay, Australia, and we also find them in Antarctica, in some of these hypersaline, very cold ponds. And the reason that they're living there does not necessarily suggest that we had hypersaline environments in the Precambrian. We may have, but more, these organisms, these bacteria, are producing stromatolites in Shark's Bay, Australia, and in Antarctica today because there's no other predators in these ponds and in these environments to go after them. And back in the Precambrian, there weren't a lot of predators either. So it's just filling that niche model of being in an area with low biodiversity, not a lot of life. And so they can take over. But in all of the images you see on the screen here, these are all stromatolites. They're these big, weird, layered, rocky bulbs. But when you cut into them, you can see the fine layers. And if they're modern, you can actually see the individual bacterial cells that are making them up. So a way of kind of showing this in a schematic, you have your oceans, and in the shallow parts of the water, you have your stromatolites forming. And they are putting out oxygen both into the water, which then diffuses into the atmosphere, which then refuses back into the seawater. You have different kind of elements and compounds floating around in seawater. You have iron, you have carbon dioxide, and you have silica. When that oxygen starts bonding with the silica and with the iron, we have a conversion where now we're depositing iron silicates, and they're all oxidized, so Fe2O3 and FeS2, iron sulfides, and iron carbonates. So we don't start seeing all of these oxidized iron-rich sediments until we start seeing a buildup of oxygen in the atmosphere and in the upper surface oxygen-rich waters. Okay, so I want you to think about this in a couple of different terms. One, how our atmosphere has changed over time. I mean, we're talking about 3.5 billion years ago, suddenly starting, or over millions of years, starting to see an increase in oxygen in the atmosphere. So here we have an example of very, very simple organisms drastically changing the atmospheric composition and the oceanic chemistry of our planet. So keep that in mind when you hear discussions about modern climate change and how there's no way that human beings could affect the climate of a planet. By all means, yeah, we can. Cyanobacteria changed the composition of the atmosphere and the oceans 3.5 billion years ago. So just not to get off on a tangent, but just something to keep in mind that this is one of the reasons why we study the history of our planet, whether it's dinosaurs or the oxygenation of our atmosphere in the Precambrian, because what happened in the past we can also learn from today. Now keep in mind that the life we're talking about in the Precambrian is predominantly single-celled, very, very small single-celled, very primitive organisms. But around 700 million years ago, towards the end of the Proterozoic, what we call the Vendian time, so a subdivision of the Proterozoic, we have our first metazoans, or multicellular organisms. Now today, the most primitive or simple multicellular organisms are things like flatworms and jellyfish. And those are the types of fossils that we actually start seeing in our very late 700 million year old Vendian Proterozoic Precambrian time. We call these fossils the Ediacaran fauna. They're named after the Ediacaran Hills in Australia, where they were first identified, but we found similar Vendian fossils all around the world, so the name just kind of stuck for the entire Ediacaran fauna. And as you can see, they're very simple, bilaterally symmetrical, soft-bodied organisms. And then they're also preserved in this very fine-grained silt with a lot of clay in it. Anything more coarse-grained isn't going to preserve the impressions of these soft-bodied organisms. But they're very, very similar to the life that we have today in our oceans that are represented by very primitive multicellular life. So here we see our modern soft-bodied marine invertebrate fauna. We have jellyfish, we have polychaete worms, we have very simple flatworms. These are the kind of things that live in the deepest parts of the oceans today and throughout the open oceans. And these are very similar to some of the oldest multicellular fossils that we have on the planet. So that leads us to believe that the type of organisms that we have today, such as these, represent very similar type of ecosystems to what we had back in the Vendian as well. And then we that brings us into the true Paleozoic era. So we're now done with the Precambrian. We are done with the Hadean, Archean, and Proterozoic, and this brings us into the Phanerozoic eon, the first era of which is the Paleozoic era, and the first period of that era is the Cambrian. So this is marked by the ability of animals to make hard shells. Okay, and this corresponds to about 550 million years ago. Now, I want you to be very clear on this. Remember, we mark the beginning of this eon, of this era, of this period, not by the time, but by the phenomenon we're seeing in the fossil record, where we now have animals building hard shells. Because in the Vendian, we just had all soft-bodied organisms. In the Proterozoic, all we had was single-celled organisms. We don't start seeing hard shells, i.e. better fossils, until what we call the Cambrian, and this was about 550 million years ago. Now, the ability to make shells is a big deal. There's a lot of advantages to this. First, you have a thing to anchor moving parts to. So I want you to think about it. If you flex your bicep right now, right, and you can flex your muscles, that's great. But if you don't have any bones to anchor those muscles to, it's kind of hard to do a lot. Okay, so hard parts, whether they're inside your body, like with us, with skeletons, or on the outside of a body, like a snail shell or a brachiopod or whatever, you have something hard to anchor those muscles onto for moving parts. This also gives you protection from predators, especially if you have an exoskeleton like an insect. So these are some of the advantages that we see with the advent of being able to produce hard parts. Not to mention, we now have a good fossil record to start looking at fossils from. Not that we don't have any fossils from the Ediacaran, of course we do, but now we have more fossils because we have more things to make fossils out of. And this is what marks the beginning of the Phanerozoic Eon, the Paleozoic era, and the Cambrian period. So here again, looking at our geologic time scale, really the entire Earth geologic time scale is going to be there on the far left. You can see there's the Precambrian, which is sometimes called the Hadean, the Archean, Proterozoic, all that makes up the Precambrian. And then really over the last just 550 million years or so is where we're left with the Phanerozoic. So let's zoom in on the middle there on the Phanerozoic. And here's where we're going to be starting, is looking at the early Paleozoic, the Cambrian and the Ordovician. So collectively about 550 million to about 440 million years ago. And this actually includes a lot of our local rocks here in Wisconsin. And then we'll get into the other periods as we go on. But notice, I just want to draw your attention. We are now talking about the beginning of the Phanerozoic Eon, the Paleozoic era, and that very first couple of periods, the Cambrian and the Ordovician. Now, if we look at the very beginning of the Cambrian, kind of look at this boundary here between the Vendian and the Cambrian. So here we're looking at the very end of the Precambrian and the beginning of the Cambrian itself. Okay, that is a C with a plus through it, which is the sign for Cambrian. Notice that we don't have a lot of different types of organisms as we go through the Vendian, but this really is our Ediacaran fauna, which you can see represented here. Okay. That's our Ediacaran fauna. We don't have much. I mean, if this is looking at diversity in number of genre, we have a few dozen. And when we go into the Cambrian, the early Cambrian, notice we don't have much more. But then all of a sudden, around this Timoshan fauna and into the all the way up through the Botamian, look at this huge increase in diversity, going up to nearly 700 different genera over a 30 million year period. We have this huge diversification event, which includes early mollusks, early brachiopods, early trilobites, early deep water burrowing worms, and archaeocyathids, all of these different invertebrate organisms, including the earliest fish, all around this time period, in the beginning of the Cambrian. So we have some major changes going on at the end of the Precambrian, the end of the Vendian. And then when we come out of those changes, essentially what's happening is temperature is dropping. So if you look over here, I'll use my highlighter, you can see this is a temperature curve. And we have quite a lot of cold conditions. And then when we go into the Cambrian, we get warm. And then we wiggle around with temperature a bit, but it stays fairly warm throughout the Cambrian. And as a result, this is a better ecological and environmental condition to boost up diversity. So we have organisms with hard parts. That's giving them an advantage to stay alive and fight off predators. Also means we have predators. And they can anchor themselves to those hard parts so they can move around a little bit easier. This increases their chances of reproducing successfully and passing those characteristics on to their offspring. So thus we have this huge boost in diversity over a 30 million year period. And that's what we call the Cambrian explosion. So this is really when we got the most primitive forms of some of our organisms that are alive today. So trilobites, for example, are a type of arthropod. Now, trilobites are extinct, but arthropods are still around today. In fact, that includes all insects and crustaceans, which are the most abundant forms of life on the planet. And it got started during the Cambrian explosion. Early vertebrates, which are simple, small, jawless fish, started in the Cambrian explosion. Our brachiopods, our mollusks, all of these got their start back in this huge boom of diversification. Now, in the Cambrian, going into the early Ordovician, we have lots and lots of trilobites. The Cambrian and the Ordovician are actually the peak at which we see trilobites, and the very earliest ones are all pretty similar. You'll notice these are all different species. These guys are kind of in a weird league on their own, but they are very primitive trilobite-like things. But the rest of them, all trilobites, and while you can point out some differences among the spines that they have, or the size of their head shield, or the size of their tail, their abdomen, and so on, overall they look pretty similar. You'd have to really study these kind of carefully to point out all the little subtle differences. So this is an important aspect of trilobites and just life in the early Cambrian, is we had very, very high diversity. Lots of different species. However, the disparity, how different those species are to each other, is very low. This would be the equivalent of looking at all the different kinds of beetles we have around the world. There's millions of species, but many of them are very, very similar looking, so the differences are subtle. So we have high diversity, lots of species, low disparity. The differences among them are minute. And that's an important thing, because what we're going to see throughout the rest of the Paleozoic, at least with trilobites, is that the more diverse they, or the more disparate they end up looking, the more different they look from each other, the fewer species we have. Before we get too far into the other kinds of early Paleozoic life, I want to talk a little bit about the stage upon which these players are acting. I want to talk a bit about the environmental conditions of the early Paleozoic and how we know about those as we set the stage to build up towards the reign of the dinosaurs. So here in Wisconsin, in this part of Wisconsin actually, we have a lot of Cambrian sediment preserved, and actually most of it represents what we call an epieric sea. An epieric sea is any type of large, long-term inundation or flooding of a continent. Okay, so epieric seas would be where you have continental crust exposed, but the sea level is so high it's actually flooded it into a shallow sea. And we're going to see a lot of epieric seas over the next few 100 million years of Earth history. But the Sauk Sea is an important one, and it's actually named after Sauk County, where we actually have a lot of that sand. So if you live anywhere close to Sauk County, you know that mining, especially of sand, is a very important thing, and that sand is used all over the world for things like foundries, making glass products, 3D printing, and so on. So it's really, really important stuff for our economy. But what you're actually digging up when they do that is sand that was deposited across Laurentia, or ancestral North America, during a transgression, a high sea level that took place during the Cambrian. So if we look at a map of the continental United States, of North America, this is what we call a facies map. We're looking at different sedimentary facies. You'll see that we have the landmass itself of the early Paleozoic, or at least the Upper Cambrian. This all would have been dry land. Okay, this is pretty much what we had for the North American craton, or the North American continent at the time. Okay, so if you could go back to the Cambrian, that'd be about it for dry land. Okay, now coming off of that dry land, we have sand. And then as we get further out to sea, we have limestones. And then in the deepest parts of the ocean basins, we have Cambrian shales, this little dark gray stuff out there beyond. Okay, so if you look at the sand that we have from the Cambrian, it eroded off of that transcontinental arch. So we had this spit of land sticking up out of the sea. It started eroding. Remember, there's no plants or anything on land yet. It's just rock sticking out of the ocean. And it starts eroding into sand, and that sand gets blown around, so think desert island. So it's eroded by wind and by waves over millions and millions of years, and gets deposited kind of right along the coastline of Laurentia, or ancestral North America. Anything past this line doesn't exist yet. We don't have anything for North America past that for the Cambrian. So we have lots and lots of Cambrian sandstones in Wisconsin. And it's very, very thick deposits. So whether you're in Sauk County or looking at some what we call the St. Peter sandstones, which are a little bit younger, we'll talk about those in a minute, you're looking at ancient beach and shoreline deposits back from about 500 million years ago. So here's a bedrock map of Wisconsin. If you stripped away all of the glacial deposits, what we have up here is remnants of that transcontinental arch. That is pre-Cambrian crust. And all of the tan that you see here, sand. That's Cambrian sand. So we have a lot of it. We have a whole lot of Cambrian sand, and then our units actually get younger as you go in that direction towards Michigan, and especially down south towards Illinois. So we have in the northern part of Wisconsin, we have Precambrian metamorphic rocks and igneous rocks, and then skirting all the way around that, we have Cambrian sands, meaning that the sand alone is derived from the erosion of some of those Precambrian, mostly Proterozoic and a little bit of Archean terrains that we have preserved in the north. So back in the Cambrian, northern Wisconsin was sitting above sea level, and where we are here in central Wisconsin, or in kind of southeastern Wisconsin, that would have all been under shallow water, but accumulating lots and lots and lots of sediment. Now, if you drive around Winnebago County, Wisconsin, drive around the whole kind of central Wisconsin area, you're going to see a lot of sandstones, but you're also going to see some upper Ordovician stuff as well, so the geological period after the Cambrian. You're going to see a lot of limestones, dollostones, and shales, because again, throughout the Cambrian and the Ordovician, this was all marine. This was all underwater. So all of our local rocks are these offshore to nearshore facies. We have deep water shales, kind of shallow water shales. We have a lot of limestone and a lot of dollostone, and our Cambrian material, and some of our earliest Ordovician material, all sands. So this was an area that would undergo subtle changes in sea level, where during the Ordovician, sea level went up, went back down. But in any case, we're seeing marine deposits. We're not seeing huge, big conglomerates necessarily at this age in this part of the state, but we do in some others. So in this part of the state, and especially this part of the Craton, we were mostly underwater to some degree or another during the early part of the Paleozoic, the Cambrian and the Ordovician periods. Now, we talked a little bit about, the advancement of hard parts as a way of protection against predators. We haven't talked much about the predators that we actually have in the early Paleozoic. So this is actually one of the top predators of the Ordovician. This is a nautiloid cephalopod. It's essentially a squid with a shell. And we do have organisms today that are like this. In the upper left corner, you can see the shell of a chambered nautilus. This is one of the last nautiloid cephalopods alive today. We have lots of different kinds of cephalopods today. We have squid and cuttlefish and octopi, but notice none of those have external shells. The nautiloid cephalopods of the Ordovician had a variety of different shaped shells, but most of them were either straight or coiled. And if you look in the inside of the shells, it's just like the modern day chambered nautilus, where you have a series of chambers, and inside each chamber you have an opening where the animal would fill this chamber with water or pump the water out and fill it with air. So if they fill it all with water, they're going to be heavier and they sink. When they pump all the water out, they become lighter and they rise. If they squirt that water out very quickly, they shoot through the water column very quickly and go after prey. So some of these things got pretty big too. As you can see here, these shells or phragmicones or orthocones can be 10 centimeters to up to 4 meters long. So yes, some of these things were pushing 12 feet long here in Oshkosh back in the Ordovician period. So there was definitely a need for organisms to have shells for protection, or in this case, a shell that helps them not only for protection from bigger nautiloid cephalopods, but also the ability to help them move around and become more mobile and move through that water column. Another important aspect of Ordovician or Cambrian and Ordovician paleoecology are reefs. Today, coral reefs make up huge areas of biodiversity, lots and lots of organisms living in close context with each other and with these very delicate interconnected ecosystems. Today, corals do make up a significant portion of our reefs, and corals belong to phylum Cnidaria, which also includes sea anemones and jellyfish. But the corals that are alive today, if you've ever been scuba diving or snorkeling into a reef and you looked at corals, none of the corals that you see alive today were around in the Paleozoic. It's an entirely different group of corals today from the Paleozoic. So our Paleozoic corals include two main categories. One that we call the rugose corals, and some of these were solitary and some of them were colonial, and our tabulate corals, which are all colonial. So in either case, the actual organisms themselves, in the case of our rugose corals, this is the actual animal. and then they grow this kind of horn-shaped shell that they live inside of. So every one of these little rings or little areas here, that was a little apartment for an individual tentacled coral polyp, similar to some of our colonial corals today. So rugose corals actually have a lot in common with modern day corals. Modern day corals can be colonial or they can be solitary, and the animal themselves look very similar. But what we usually find in the fossil record is just the colony or the shell itself. Now, tabulate corals are all colonial, and they're very, very small animals that lived in these really big, complex colonies. If you look very closely at the chain-like structure here, and you see the individual little holes, that's where the individual coral polyps were living, not in these big open black void spaces. They were living in the tiny little chain links of these tabulate corals. So the way that tabulates actually work is you would have a stack of little tablets, so to speak, and each one has a little window. And in each one of those little windows is where you would find an individual polyp. So if you have a coral, a tabulate coral the size of your fist, it probably held close to 1,000 different animals in it, all the same species, making up this condo or this apartment complex that they all lived in with their little windows they can stick their tentacles out of and feed as they see fit. Now, all of these corals are now extinct. Most of them go extinct around the mid-Paleozoic, and then we have a gap where we don't have corals for a long time until we get to the Mesozoic. So Paleozoic corals are very diverse, but very different than the ones that we have today. Now, as I mentioned before, we do have fish in the early Paleozoic. We do have our first vertebrates, but they're a little different than what we think of as fish today. Most of us, when we think of fish, we don't think of these types of organisms, or at least fish that don't look like this. These are ostracoderms, which the name literally means armored skin. Most of these fish are actually cartilaginous, just like sharks. So in other words, their skeletons are more or less cartilage, but these guys actually had armor plates on the external portion of their bodies. So they had not really scales the way we think of fish scales today, but big bony plates. And they were also jawless. So they were very armored, they were very flexible, and they had no jaws, which essentially means that they swam around the seafloor and kind of vacuumed up algae. So if you have a fish tank, you might have a fish that you put in there that's job is to pretty much stick to the side of the tank and eat algae. That's what these guys were doing, except they were a little bit bigger and they were armored. Now, this is a good first step, though, towards getting jawed fish, or the gnathostomes, and then moving past that into terrestrial vertebrates. So this is kind of the first step of fish evolution, which is something we want to pay attention to during the Paleozoic. One of the other kind of new types of organisms we get in the Paleozoic are echinoderms. Now again, echinoderms are still around today. We still have starfish and sea cucumbers and sea urchins and these things called crinoids, but they all look a little different than the ones from the early Paleozoic. This is a kind of classic example of a crinoid. It looks like a plant. It really does. In fact, their nicknames are sea lilies. However, this is an animal, and echinoderms are probably one of the weirdest groups of organisms we have on the planet today, or if not ever. So let me walk you through echinoderms. Their bodies are, the name echinoderm means spiny skin, and their bodies are made up of a series of calcium carbonate plates. In fact, they're one of the only organisms here that actually grows pretty good sized crystals for their bodies. They grow calcium carbonate crystals, and each plate that makes up the external surface of their body is an individual crystal. So while crinoids, like I've circled, look like plants, the thing that looks like roots at the bottom, those are actually tube feet, each one made of a series of little calcium carbonate rings. That long stem, the columnals, or the stalk, is a flexible, movable, kind of snake-like stalk. The head of the organism, what we call the arboreal cup, is made of a series of little plates, and branching off of them in the crown are these long arms with what look like pine needles or pinnules at the end, but each one is a solid, sharp crystal. So echinoderms, like crinoids, would plant themselves in the sediment, and they would branch out the arms of their crown and wait for some piece of organic detritus to fall through the water column and land on that arm to where it grabs that piece of food and then sticks it down into the arboreal cup for it to digest. Now, another weird thing about all echinoderms, they don't really have blood, muscle, nervous system, a digestive system, the way that we would think of them for ourselves or most other animals. In fact, these echinoderms pull seawater into their bodies and they squeeze it through tubes, and they move entirely through hydraulic action. So those tube feet move because they increase the osmotic pressure inside their body, and it causes the tube to move. They're entirely hydraulic organisms. They're very, very strange. The importance of this group of echinoderms, though, in the Ordovician is how their distribution and their success led to something that we have today, both in aquatic and terrestrial realms, for how organisms can live so close together in an ecosystem. And we call that tearing. Tearing. We see tearing in coral reefs. We also see tearing in forests. Tearing is the ability of organisms to live side by side and have different jobs in that niche by being taller or deeper down than their neighbor. So, for example, if we look at the Ordovician, we have burrowing clams, we have corals that are close to the sediment-water interface, and then we have our crinoids that are kind of towering over them. Now remember, towering over them so they can get organic material that they're suspension feeding out of the water. So they're getting first dibs at whatever's falling through the water column. Our organisms at the lower tiered level are going to get what's left over. And then our burrowing organisms are going to get whatever's in the sediment that everybody else missed. So we're all living close together, and we're all going after a food source, but we're picking up, we have our individual jobs. Some are getting things high in the canopy, some in the mid-level, some low, and some in the litter below. And notice how tearing increases as we go through the Paleozoic. And then in the Mesozoic, we have another spike. And then our Cenozoic today, our tearing in the oceans, is very infaunal, so it's really down in the sediment. But this living at different levels, this tearing, think about how this works in a rainforest. You have organisms that live high in the tree canopy, things that live actually in the tree trunks and branches themselves, organisms that live down at the base, and then some things that live underground next to the trees. All of that is tearing. So this expanding into new niches and new jobs through tearing is something that starts in the late Cambrian, early Ordovician, predominantly with echinoderms like crinoids. So this brings us out of the Cambrian, Ordovician, early Paleozoic chunk and brings us to the mid-Paleozoic, which is composed of the Silurian and Devonian periods. So Silurian from, looking at the end of the Ordovician, this is about 440 million years ago, all the way through the end of the Devonian, which is about 355 million years ago. Again, just to remind you, these time periods are not based on time necessarily. It's not like it's 440 million years, it's time for a new period. No, instead they are based and described based on their fossil content. So the fossils that typify the time period that happens to be from about 550 to 480 million years ago is the Cambrian fauna, the Cambrian period. From about 480 to 440, that's what we call the Ordovician time, because those fossils that exist during that time are a little different. Similarly, the fossils we see in the rocks from 440 to 410 million years ago are unique, and we call that time period the Silurian because of it. And just like that, from about 410, maybe 415 to about 335 million years ago, that's the Devonian fauna and thus the Devonian time. So let's take a look back about 420 million years ago at what the world looked like. As you can see, North America, or what we call Laurentia at this time, is over here actually kind of straddling the equator, and most of Laurentia is south of the equator. We are attached to the region known as Baltica. Siberia is hanging out here up at the higher mid-latitude. China, Kazakhstan, these are actually a series of islands at the time, and most of the rest of the continental world is all crammed together in this big supercontinent in the southern hemisphere called Gondwana. Now, when you see this symbol align with like a jagged tooth on it, that is evidence of a subduction zone. So what we're saying is we have subduction going on right near Iberia or Amorica. We have another subduction zone pushing things away from Avalonia, and we have another one up here just north of Baltica. So we have active tectonic activity moving things around, and we know by looking at this and looking at a globe today that the continents don't stay in these positions. We know through plate tectonics that they continue to move around because the lithospheric plates they're attached to are moving around. But this kind of gives you an idea that most of our continents are actually in the southern hemisphere during this time. And from the Silurian to the Devonian, we're going to see some major changes, especially glaciations in Gondwana. So this big supercontinent down here is going to start developing big, massive continental ice sheets. And as that seawater gets pulled out of the oceans and it gets frozen and stored on the Gondwanan continent down on the South Pole, we're going to see a global falling of sea level. So that's the reason why I'm showing you what's going on tectonically, because when you have a tectonic relationship like we have here, and we start to see sea levels falling because of climate, what is that going to do to the organisms that are living in Laurentia, living in Baltica, living in Siberia at the time? They're going to have to adapt to an environment of lowering sea levels and changing the ways that organisms can interact with each other and their environment. Now, one of the things that starts to happen during the Silurian and the Ordovician as sea levels are falling is we start to see a lot of our coral reefs go into overdrive for a little while. In fact, the Silurian is one of the peak times for Paleozoic corals. So today, if you look around parts of eastern Wisconsin, northeastern down into southern Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, up into Michigan, and we're labeling this on our diagram here as carbonates, this kind of brick pattern. That's all limestone. That's all Silurian and Devonian age limestone. It's all over the place. Now, in some areas, like around Lake Michigan, going down into Indiana, Ohio, around into Michigan too, even parts of Canada, we have these big barrier reefs from the Silurian, a little bit in the Devonian, but mostly the Silurian. So these reefs, for example, if you go over to Lake Winnebago here in Oshkosh, and you look across the lake and you see High Cliff State Park, that's part of what we call the Niagara Escarpment. And that is a Silurian reef that extends all the way to Niagara Falls. Now that was once a fossil, that's a fossil reef, so it was once a reef community. This is a big reef. So notice though, around what we call the Michigan Basin, we have patch reefs and barrier reefs all the way around it. Now think about it, sea levels going down. Our corals are happy because they're in shallow water as that sea level is falling. But inside of that reef patch, this large one in the case the size of Michigan, you have water level that's not, it's also evaporating, it's going down, but at the same time all of the minerals in that water are getting concentrated together. So we have reduced circulation in those areas. Okay, it's kind of dammed off by these coral reefs in the Silurian. As a result, we start seeing things like halites and gypsums, these different types of evaporative salts forming inside those areas. So today, if you go to Michigan and you look at the geology there, you'll see layer upon layer of different rocks. And your Silurian rocks are almost always gypsums and halites. So they're evaporites because we had reduced circulation in these basins, in the Ohio Basin, the Appalachian Basin, the Michigan Basin. All of these areas had reduced ocean circulation because sea level was falling and the coral reefs were building up. So everything in the middle just kind of got stuck there, the water in there. And so you have these very unique geological deposits in the Silurian because of these characteristics that we have for sea level at the time. Another really important phylum of the Middle Paleozoic are brachiopods. Now, brachiopods have been around since the early Cambrian, and in fact, the ones that we see the most of in the early Cambrian are these. These are called the lingulids. They're the most primitive, inarticulate brachiopods. What that means is when these organisms die, their two shells just kind of fall apart. There's nothing to articulate them together other than a little fleshy ligament. Now, this specimen probably looks very modern, and that's because these are. Lingulid brachiopods have been around since the early Cambrian, so about 540 million years ago, and this particular group of brachiopods are still alive today. All other brachiopods that you see here are articulate brachiopods, which were very, very diverse throughout the Paleozoic. Now, today, we don't have a lot of different types of brachiopods. Notice how these look very similar to clams. In fact, some of you might be thinking that these are bivalve clams. They're actually in a totally separate phylum. So these and clams are more separate than, or just as different from each other as you are to a clam. They're totally separate phyla. However, they occupy the same niche. So back in the Paleozoic, if you were to go walking along beaches, these are the shells you'd be picking up. Today, you walk along beaches, you pick up mostly bivalve clams. So these organisms were filter feeders. They would attach to the substrate or dig this fleshy stalk into the sediment, and they'd open up their valves. It's not a mouth like a beak. There's just their two protective valves, and they would extend out this kind of a weird feathery looking structure that is called a lophophore. It's a weird feather-shaped structure that they would extend out, and they would filter feed. So when we find them as fossils, they can be completely contained in little packages, or we can find entire blocks of limestone made of almost nothing but brachiopods, indicating just how successful this group was and how important they were to mid-Paleozoic marine ecosystems. As we revisit trilobites from the early Paleozoic, we see that in the Silurian and the Devonian, we don't have quite as many trilobites as we did before, i.e. the diversity is down, but the disparity is up. For example, we can tell the difference from these trilobites much easier than we could in the early Paleozoic. These have adaptations like stalked eyes, they have spines coming off their body in a variety of different places, and some of them even have the ability to roll up into a kind of a cute little ball for protection, similar to a sow bug or a pill bug that you'd see today. So we went from lots and lots of very simple species to fewer but more specialized species. So in other words, diversity went down, but disparity has gone considerably up. So this is a classic example of the relationship between diversity and disparity that we see throughout the fossil record. The mid-Paleozoic is also home to a new type of predator, this time a giant arthropod known as a Eurypterid, or nicknamed the sea scorpions. Some of these can be as big as your hand, and as you can see from the illustration, some of them can be 2 or 3 meters long. These are predators. Some of them are probably omnivorous. A few may have been herbivorous, but a predominantly number of them were actually predatory. Now, despite the nickname sea scorpion and something of a similar, visual comparison, they're actually not closely related to scorpions. They're not arachnids. These are more closely related to horseshoe crabs. Still, a number of the fossils that we find from Eurypterids are actually molts. If you think about modern-day arthropods, whether it's a crustacean or an insect or an arachnid, they grow by molting. They will shed that exoskeleton, they'll grow to a larger size, and they'll mineralize a new exoskeleton. And Eurypterids did the same thing. So occasionally we'll find Eurypterid parts, and that's actually left behind from a living Eurypterid, not a dead Eurypterid, because they shed that exoskeleton and then grew a new one. So there's a couple of characteristics like what parts are missing, what parts do we have for things like Eurypterids and trilobites that let us know whether they're molts or whether we're looking at an entire specimen. Either way, these are the new dominant predator of the mid-Paleozoic. Incidentally, in the Silurian, we also have our first true terrestrial scorpions. In fact, these are the first animals to ever work their way on to land, are arachnids like scorpions and spiders that might creep you out if you're a little bit of an arachnophobic, but really they were on land first. We'll talk a little bit more about the diversity of life on land here in a bit, but yeah, scorpions and Eurypterids, our false sea scorpions, are both around at about the same time. The Devonian period is sometimes referred to as the Age of Fishes. And by the way, as a caveat, I wanted to mention that fishes is a totally appropriate term when you are describing more than one species of fish. And as the Devonian is when we first see our major and initial diversification of vertebrate aquatic life, or the diversification of fish, we can actually say the Devonian truly is the Age of Fishes. Notably, in the Devonian period, we have the first fish with jaws. This is a specific group known as the acanthodians. And notice the way their jaws and fins look are a little bit weird, in their eyes too, a little bit weird than how we would think of fish today. Not trying to mock anybody, but these fish always kind of reminded me of like the way a child would draw a fish. The fins look a little different, the jaws and the eyes look a little different, but nonetheless, this is actually accurate to the fossil record. So acanthodians had one large spine coming off of each fin and then a webby piece of flesh that was connected to the body. Their eyes indeed were very large and very close to the front of the snout, and their jaws were very, very primitive, again, because they're the earliest known jawed fish. So where do jaws actually come from? Well, actually by studying the embryos of a variety of jawless and jawed vertebrates, we can actually see where jaws came from. So if we look at the first diagram here we see on the far left, this is the essential skeleton of a jawless fish, something like a lamprey or a hagfish, where the skull, or the cranium, is just kind of a cartilaginous blob that houses the eyes and the brain. The mouth is perpetually open, but because these are organisms that breathe through gills, they have these skeletal rods made of cartilage that keep the gill slits open so they can actually breathe underwater while they swim. So we have skeletal support rods to keep the gills open, and these are made again out of cartilage. As we move from left to right, we can actually watch what happens with some of these skeletal gill support rods as the animal develops further and gestates as it's getting ready to be born. Those gill arches, actually those skeletal rods, migrate forward and attach to the cranium and become the upper and lower jaws respectively from the upper and lower skeletal gill slit support rods. And then teeth evolved much later. So we actually had jawed fish before we had toothed or toothed fish. So it's something that we can actually observe in modern day organisms during their embryological development, during their ontogeny, and we can see evidence of it throughout the fossil record as well. If you'll remember, in the Ordovician, we had our first armored fish known as the ostracoderms. Well, that characteristic becomes a little bit more advanced in the Devonian, where we have the placoderms, which the name means plate skin. They're very similar to ostracoderms in the fact that their skeletons are mostly cartilaginous, except for these armored shields on the body. However, these are jawed fish. They actually do have jaws, while the ostracoderms did not, the placoderms do. And so placoderms, again, were a wide variety of different kind of armored jawed fish in the Devonian. Some eating crustaceans and some eating algae, but we have one that is particularly impressive. This is the giant placoderm from the Devonian, Dunkleosteus. These are measured to be up to 10 meters long, so that's approaching 30 feet. Dunkleosteus, you see, has an armored skull. It has what look like tooth projections. Those are actually sharpened edges of bone from its skull that stick out of its mouth to serve as teeth, because these aren't socketed teeth the way we would think of ours today. And the rest of their body was cartilage. However, I do want to point out that the eyeball is armored as well, which really makes you wonder what this thing needed so much protection from. Turns out we have a lot of Dunkleosteus specimens from Cleveland, Ohio, of all places. That was where we find a lot of Dunkleosteus specimens that are bitten by other Dunkleosteus. They have armor, scars in their armor from combat with other dunks. So this is a really kind of famous Paleozoic fish because it's so huge and it's so strange. It's like a giant aquatic tank with a can opener for a mouth and armored eyeballs. Evolution does some weird stuff sometimes. We also have our first sharks in the Silurian and the Devonian, especially in the Devonian. Sharks, again, because their bodies are entirely cartilaginous, we don't find much from them other than their teeth. However, what we do see from mid-Paleozoic shark teeth is a wide variety of different tooth shapes, which implies a wide variety of different diets. Today, most of our sharks have sharp pointed teeth because they're hyperpredators. We have a few that may eat crustaceans and some that are actually algal suspension feeders, like the whale shark, the biggest fish in the world, but most of them have sharp, flesh-tearing teeth. We see a bit more of a diversity, though, in the mid-Paleozoic. You can see some of these teeth are long with lots of ridges for eating things like small shellfish. Some have very large mushroom-shaped crowns, which are good for crushing more durable shells. And then indeed we do have some that are more sharp, like we see with our modern sharks today. With all this talk of cartilaginous fish in the mid-Paleozoic, it does important to note that we do get our first true bony fish, so fish with internal bony skeletons in the mid-Paleozoic, and these are the paleoniscoids. You'll notice that, again, their eyes are very large, very much in the front of the face. They have very primitive jaws and very simple fins, but these are the first fish that have true internal bony skeletons, not just cartilage and not just armor. They do have very durable scales on the outside of their bodies, but the skeleton that they have is mineralized on the inside as well. And for the practical purposes of our course and probably our own interest, we have another group of fish that diversifies in the Devonian. These are known as the lobe-finned fish, or properly known as the Rhippidistians. What makes Rhippidistians so unique is that they don't have fins with very thin skin membranes and long bony rays like our modern day fish or even the paleoniscoids or the acanthodians. These fins are more robust. They're made of more robust bones that are diversified into different segments and sections. And these are the fish, such as lungfish and so on, that we can clearly see an evolutionary record from them to the earliest terrestrial amphibians. So when you look at the fins of a lobe-finned fish, when you look at the bones that make up those fleshy lobes, you can see an early pelvis, an early femur, an early radius, ulna, and so on, and where those bones that we have as terrestrial vertebrates are going to start getting their initial form. So the Rhippidistians, the lobe-finned fish, if you're a terrestrial vertebrate like we all are, this is the common ancestor between humans and dogs and cats and reptiles and birds and so on. Any terrestrial organism, the Rhippidistians are the most basal form of that. So when we look at this chart, we can see why the Devonian is known as the Age of Fishes. It may not be when all of these groups of fish got their first start, but it's certainly when we see the biggest peak in a majority of them. We get our first jawless fish in the Cambrian, but it's not until the Devonian that they're very abundant in different diversities. Same thing with the placoderms. They start in the Silurian, and they're very successful in Devonian, and then they go extinct. Sharks start at the late Silurian and have their first big boom in the Devonian. Acanthodians are at their peak in the Devonian. Our ray-finned fish, the modern fish we have today, like your bass and goldfish and carp, get started in the Devonian. Lobe-finned fish are initially very, very abundant in the Devonian and then decrease. And because they're related to them, tetrapods, four-legged terrestrial animals, are an offshoot of lobe-finned fish, and they get their initial start in the late Devonian as well. So collectively, this is when diversity is the most significant, and this is why we call it the Age of Fishes. By the late Devonian, we see the onset of yet another one of our big five mass extinctions, and this seems to correspond with global cooling and a global sea level fall. As continents are realigning throughout the planet, throughout the Cambrian, Ordovician, Silurian, and Devonian, we start seeing ice ages pop up in extreme latitudes like the South Pole and the North Pole, and this is going to fluctuate sea level. Notice, though, that we have a couple of new mountain ranges on the east coast of North America at this time. Well, our modern-day east-coast, notice the dotted line indicating where the equator was, or where North America was in relation to the equator. We're rotated about 90 degrees clockwise and straddling the equator at this point, but we have a large mountain range known as the Acadian Mountains through like an early stage of the Appalachians that circumnavigates all the way up to Greenland. And sediment is shedding off of these mountains and filling in the continental United States as sea level is going down. So this starts to become a very muddy environment in the late Devonian. And as this happens throughout the Silurian, throughout the Devonian, life starts to extend onto land more, but it's pretty swampy and mucky still. So a Silurian landscape and even a Devonian landscape would look very, very different than anything we have on Earth today. But I want to take a few moments to talk about some of the earliest life on land in the Devonian. This is when we start seeing seeds, true trees, insects, and amphibians. So we get the first life on land in the Silurian in the form of animals. And by the Devonian, we're starting to see a more inland diversification. One of the earliest and most well-preserved land plants from the Silurian is Cooksonia. It's not very big. It's only 10 to 20 centimeters high. It's leafless. It kind of looks like a waxy little series of twigs sticking out of the ground, but that is one of the earliest and best preserved plants that we have from the Silurian. Notice the little cups on the top of Cooksonia. This is known as the sporangium. This is where a lot of spores would be formed, and then they would blow away in the wind, and those spores would land on another Cooksonia or somewhere in the shoreline, and you would now have new scrubby little twigs of Cooksonia coming up. One of the interesting things about Cooksonia is one of the first land plants that develops a waxy cuticle over its structure, and this helps it prevent water loss, because think about it. Most plants that we had prior to this were in the water. If you're a plant on land, you have to have adaptations to keep yourself from losing water and for reproducing. So wind-blown spores and the waxy cuticle are both adaptations for a terrestrial lifestyle. And of course, our earliest land animals in the mid-Paleozoic, from the Silurian predominantly, late Silurian, are arthropods. These are things like myriapods, which are things like millipedes or centipedes, which in this case can be up to about close to a meter in length. We have spider-like arachnids known as trigonotarbids. So if you don't like spiders and arachnids, which have their 8 legs, these have 10 legs, so they're slightly creepier. And then scorpions, which we've already discussed. So there's a relationship, though, between the order in which life moves onto land. In the late Ordovician, we have our earliest evidence of very primitive land plants, but they're still in mostly aquatic environments. By the early Silurian, we're seeing things like Cooksonia and other very primitive land plants. And then by the late Silurian going into the Devonian, we start getting our first terrestrial life in the form of arthropods. Today, we know there's a relationship between arthropods and plants for use of pollination and distributing reproductive products and also food. And that relationship seems to go all the way back to the mid-Paleozoic. And with that, that brings us to the late Paleozoic, which is described based on these two geologic periods, the Carboniferous and the Permian. Now, I want to point something out about the Carboniferous. The term Carboniferous is a European term to describe this geologic period, and in Europe, they break down the Carboniferous into an early Carboniferous and a late Carboniferous. We do the same thing here, except we have very unique geologic differences and paleontological differences between the early and late Carboniferous. So we have named them the Mississippian for the early and the Pennsylvanian for the late. So if you see early Carboniferous, that's equivalent of Mississippi, and if it's late Carboniferous or upper Carboniferous, that would be equivalent to Pennsylvanian. Regardless, this major time period spans from about 355 to 290 million years ago, and it is followed by the Permian, which is the last of our Paleozoic geologic periods. And the Permian goes from about 290 to about 255, and it is terminated by the biggest mass extinction the planet has ever seen. And this will help round out the Paleozoic, where we will then have set the stage for what the world was like during the Mesozoic era, the next geologic era, which starts with the Triassic. But first, let's get through the Carboniferous and the Permian. It's during the late Paleozoic that Pangaea, the supercontinent we talked about when we introduced plate tectonics, finally forms. And here in this flow chart, you can see early Devonian, early Mississippian, late Pennsylvanian to early Permian, and see how Pangaea comes together. By the early Devonian, Gondwana and North America are very close to each other, but there's still a pretty large seaway in between. By the Mississippian, these two continents have started to collide, and we have a very small incipient mountain range forming in between them. We also see the advent of glaciations forming in southern Gondwana. By the Pennsylvanian, we have the Alleghanian orogeny. This is another name for the Appalachians, where we've sutured North America, Laurentia, onto Gondwana, and our glaciations are also still ongoing. And then in the early Permian, we have Pangaea fully assembled. It's one giant supercontinent with a big mountain in the middle of it and glaciers forming in the southern hemisphere. And this type of geographic orientation and assemblage of continents, so we have a planet with one giant continent and then the rest of the planet is an even more giant ocean, has some very unique ramifications for climate. that are rather important to take note of. So again, here we are in the early Carboniferous, or the Mississippi, and about 356 million years ago. And you'll notice that we have the initial uplift of the Appalachian Mountains. Euramerica, or also known as Laurentia, is moving closer to Gondwana. We're starting to rotate counterclockwise a bit, so we're no longer rotated and straddling the equator. We're kind of moving back up into the northern hemisphere. But Pangaea is starting to come together at this point. Now in the Pennsylvanian, things change quite a lot. Sea level is much lower and it's much more variable. And I wanted to say something about climate for a moment. How, if you think about the way that climate is distributed today, weather patterns and so on, it has to do with ocean currents and how they move wind and air around. And the oceans are, in turn, the size that they are and the shape that they are because of the continents surrounding them. So if you move the continents, you move and you change the shape of the ocean. If you change the shape of the ocean and you move the continents, you change the way that you distribute climate. And that's happening here in the Pennsylvanian. So the Pennsylvanian is characterized by low and variable sea level, so it went up and down a lot. And geographically, it's important to note that here in the Midwest, we're kind of right on the shoreline of where the continental portion of North America was, the highlands, and then the muddy lowlands. So if you look right along the coastline, you actually see Pennsylvanian age delta and river deposits, where rivers and deltas were coming down from the mountains and spreading sediment all around and helping pile up part of North America. Now, if it's a coastal environment and there's lots of plants, as we now know we have in the Pennsylvanian, we're going to start getting lots of plant deposits. So imagine a forest that gets buried. The plant material turns into pure carbon, which means it turns into coal. So when you look at the coal that is mined today out of places like Kentucky, West Virginia, and so on, that is Pennsylvanian aged coal. That's where we get the name Pennsylvania. It's because the coal that we get out of Pennsylvania is also Pennsylvanian in age. So when we burn this coal, we're taking carbon dioxide that these plants stored back in the Pennsylvanian, and we're re-releasing it into the atmosphere. So there's a little bit of a context of the coal that we use and the swamps that they represent. With all of this plant life, though, in these tropical forests on the coasts of the Pennsylvanian, we have lots and lots of oxygen. In fact, there's a huge oxygen spike. The biggest jump in oxygen we've seen since the Proterozoic happens in the Pennsylvanian. Another interesting side note from all of this oxygen is that we now have amphibians on land. We have more oxygen than we had before, so animals are going to start moving onto land to utilize that. And insects grow very uniquely where they actually breathe in between the segments of their bodies. So this creates an arms race for arthropods and insects to grow larger and larger and larger. So if you've ever heard about something about how in the past there were dragonflies the size of, a yardstick, that would be during this time. And absolutely. We also have millipedes that are 8 feet long. They would have been like a crawling surfboard, which is kind of cool. So we have a lot of coal-bearing Pennsylvanian rocks at the surface in places like the Michigan Basin, Allegheny Basin, Illinois Basin, and a little bit west, and even some up in New England. But there's even more Pennsylvanian rocks beneath the surface as we move further west, where we have more marine sediments and less terrestrial sediments, because remember, where the Michigan, Illinois, and Allegheny Basins are in the Pennsylvanian is right along that coastline, where we would be getting lots of coal-producing rocks today. So we've mentioned in the Pennsylvanian, we have variable sea levels, meaning they go up and down. We know we have areas that are coastal where we're getting lots and lots of swamps today preserved as coal. And these are right on the margins between the terrestrial setting where we're going to have lakes and rivers, and deeper out into the oceans where we have marine settings forming things like limestone and coral reefs. So what would happen if sea level went up and then went back down and then went up again? Well, you'd have the entire depositional record preserved. And that's what we have for the Pennsylvanian, is something called a Pennsylvanian cyclothem. It's a repeating sequence of sedimentary deposits, we have over 100 of them, that result from transgression and regression cycles, so relative sea level rise and fall, each one lasting 400,000 years. So that means, let's say you approach central Illinois in the Pennsylvanian period, and it's like it is in Figure A. You're standing on some rivers and some floodplains. There's a regression. The shoreline is all the way down in Missouri and further down south and further west. However, sea level then goes up during a transgression, and where you were standing in central Illinois on dry land, it is now underwater with a marginal marine deposit. And then sea level drops back down and you go back to the conditions you had during Figure A. That whole series of being low, sea level getting high, and then getting low again is one cyclothem that lasts approximately 400,000 years. And then we start it over and over. This doesn't happen today. We don't have this type of resolution of sea level fluctuations today. This is unique to the Pennsylvanian period and maybe one other time in the geologically recent past. The type of sea level we're seeing here, the sea level changes, is not caused necessarily by tectonics, right? We know that sea level can be caused by tectonics. It can also be isostatic. In this case, we're looking at a eustatic effect, which, if you remember the difference between isostatic and eustatic effects, isostatics are changes in the continental placement tectonically. Eustatic is climate driven, and that's what we're seeing here. So we have 400,000 year cycles caused by ice ages. So during the part of Figure A where we have a regression and sea levels are lower, they're further out to sea, that means we're seeing very cold conditions. Well, how do we know? Well, because when things get cold, you evaporate water out of the ocean. That lowers eustatic sea level, and you store that water in the form of ice on a continent. When warming conditions appear, you melt that ice, it goes back to the oceans, and it rises sea level up. Okay, so we're going from a low to a high to a low again every 400,000 years, and that is not something we have a record for. We have a record that goes back millions of years for climate. That is not something we see on a 400,000 year cycle, except in very unique situations. So the cause of this 400,000 year cyclothem cycle, this climate change that we're seeing that happens so rapidly, is the growing and shrinking of ice sheets in Gondwana, the supercontinent of Antarctica, Australia, Africa, South America, and India, during the late Carboniferous, during the Pennsylvanian. So why then? Why in the late Pennsylvanian and not in the Mississippian or Ordovician or today? And that's because there are some parameters that are at play that are going to dictate how much solar radiation the planet gets. And these are always at play, but usually there's something happening on Earth that overshadows that influence. But during the late Carboniferous, as we break apart things and we move continents together and we change the shape of the oceans and the continents, and we have a big mountain range running through the center of this giant continent, it changes climate. Our climate situation becomes totally unstable. By the late Permian, the supercontinent of Pangaea is firmly attached and full. We have the central Pangaean Mountains, also known as the Alleghanians, also known as the Appalachians. So the Appalachian Mountains, if you've ever seen those are the residual scar tissue of Pangaea. And you can see from just this artistic illustration, we have a lot of yellow and pale greens. That indicates arid conditions. So one of the things that we see happening during the Permian when Pangaea is together is that it starts getting cooler and it starts becoming very, very dry, expansions of deserts. And this makes sense because normally you get rainfall because water evaporates out of the ocean and it moves onto land and it dumps out its moisture content. When you have a gigantic supercontinent, you're going to get some rain along your coastlines, but by the time those weather patterns reach the continental interior, especially if there's a mountain range, they're going to be completely spent on any moisture in that cloud. So as a result, we get what's called a rain shadow effect. And this is something we see today with India going into Tibet, where you have very, very different climates on these different two sides of this physical barrier in the case of a mountain. So Pangaea is so big, it's hard to get moisture to the continental interior, and the mountain range that's circumnavigating in between doesn't exactly help. So again, the sheer size of Pangaea affects its climate. the Permian world, the late Paleozoic world in the Permian, was very arid and quite cool because it was just so big. The supercontinent of Pangaea in the Permian was too big to get moisture to the continental interior. This also puts the planet into a situation of increased seasonality. So we're going to see monsoons and incredible dry seasons. Those coal forests we had in the Pennsylvanian are now gone. We just don't have the moisture to maintain them anymore. But looking at the paleogeography of the Permian, you can see that we still have these big, large Appalachian mountains, and we're attached to Africa. And on the far west coast of what is now North America, we have a trench where we are subducting crust and we're producing a series of volcanic islands. But the take-home message here is that the terrestrial habitats have expanded considerably with the subsequent uplift and erosion of the Alleghanian Mountains. As the Appalachians grow larger, they erode more, which then spreads that sediment out into the continent. In the highlands, we have deserts in the Midwest as well, and then the lowlands are pretty swampy, kind of leftover conditions from the Pennsylvanian. And then far out west, we have subduction and very, very explosive volcanism. And this is going to be important as we move into the Mesozoic, because this is the type of trench that starts changing things volcanically and with climate, and in addition to some other factors, throughout the Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous. And then we conclude the Permian period, also the Paleozoic era, with the biggest mass extinction that our planet has ever seen, which is why we change eras. We say end of the Paleozoic, beginning of the Mesozoic, because this wiped out so many types of organisms. We had to create a new era to describe how different everything looked afterwards. How big was this? We're talking 90 to 95% of all marine species went extinct at the end of the Permian. Now keep in mind that most of the life on Earth is in the oceans today. So losing 95% is practically like losing everything. This is the end of the dominance of the Paleozoic fauna. When we come out of this into the Triassic period, that's the beginning of our modern marine fauna. This is called the Great Dying, or the greatest environmental disaster in Earth history, and it does appear to be climate related. So what caused it, though? There's lots and lots of different theories. Climate change and sea level fall are an important aspect of this, but these are somewhat gradual processes, though we do have this concept called threshold events, which is a slow process. But when you get to a certain point, it's like past the point of no return, and then you have a rapidly cascading series of events. That's a possibility here. We do have evidence in Siberia of massive basaltic eruptions known as the Deccan Traps during this time as well. Now that's going to be spewing lots of carbon dioxide and methane into the atmosphere, which is going to change, again, climate and weather patterns. Ocean acidification is a very, very well-studied aspect that we have a lot of evidence for. If you have mildly acidic oceans, it's very difficult for an organism to make a shell out of calcium carbonate. And we do see evidence of shells being produced during this time that are much thinner than they should be. And we're starting to see it with some of the very small copepod shells today. These are shells that are too thin for the organisms to survive long term. Well, why are they suddenly growing thin shells? Because the oceans have become marginally more acidic. And we think this is what was going on in the Permian as well. If you have an extinction and you need to come up with a reason for it, it's always wise to throw, I don't know if it's wise, but it's something everybody does, throw asteroid or cometary impact into it. There's no evidence for an asteroid impact at the end of the Permian, but there's a lot of evidence for climate change and ocean acidification, which do go hand in hand, and the volcanic eruptions play a role in that too. It seems that the asteroid or comet impact hypothesis for the Permo-Triassic extinction is the only one that really doesn't have any weight to it. But as we end the Paleozoic era, the Permian period, that mass extinction that happens at the end of the Paleozoic, at the end of the Permian, sets the stage for whole new opportunities of diversification. Specifically, one very specialized group of reptiles, the dinosaurs. Now, before we finish things up, I do have one quick thing I want to do. I normally would do a pop quiz in class. However, in this case, I'm going to include it here because these are questions to consider as you're reviewing your notes. Okay, so this isn't for credit. This isn't right or wrong. These are just the kind of questions you can start to expect. First, what are the 3 eons that compose the Precambrian? Okay, there's 3 of them. Could you name one of them? Could you name all of them? 2, what evolutionary novelty is used to define the beginning of the Paleozoic era? So think back. First period of the Paleozoic era is the Cambrian, 550 million years ago. What is the advantage that organisms have in the Cambrian that makes us say, oh, okay, this is different, we're marking a new time? 3, in the early to mid-Cambrian, there is a very large rapid diversification of species event, and what do we call that? 4, what is the name of that repeating sequence that we saw of transgressions and regressions from the Pennsylvanian period that suggest rapid changes in climate? And 5, what's the generalized climate of Pangaea at the end of the Permian period? So we can do a little quick post-mortem here. 3 eons comprise the Precambrian. Name one of them. Well, there's 3. You could say Hadean, Archean, or Proterozoic. Those are the 3 eons that produce the Precambrian. Number 2, what evolutionary novelty is used to define the beginning of the Paleozoic era? The Cambrian, the beginning of the Cambrian is marked by the presence of mineralized hard parts. This is when we start getting organisms that have exoskeletons, thus increasing our geologic record and allowing us to easily define where we have the beginning of the Cambrian. But as that was happening, what's the rapid diversification event of species in the early to mid-Cambrian? That'd be the Cambrian explosion, which no, was not literally an explosion. It's just a euphemism to describe a almost continuous outpouring of new kinds of species. The name of the repeating sequence of transgressions and regressions from the Pennsylvanian period that suggest rapid changes in climate are cyclothems. Pennsylvanian cyclothems. And of course, the generalized climate of Pangaea at the end of the Permian period, cool and arid. It was dry and cool. So think Tibet, but maybe not that bad. Not as bad, but arid and cool. Mongolia, arid and cool. That's what a vast portion of Pangaea looked like. So that concludes the lecture content for week 5. Next week, we will jump into dinosaurs. We're going to be, now that we have the stage set, we've looked at what happened before, we have our stratigraphic and evolutionary tools under our belt, we're now ready to jump in and actually look at what exactly makes a dinosaur. So, we'll see you soon.